Hey everybody, it's Phil Strazula from Select Software Reviews, and today I'm joined by Teddy Chestnut, who is the founder of BrightHire, and we're going to talk about quality of hire, what it is, how do you measure it, why is it important, basically everything you need to know. Teddy, thanks for joining us. Do you mind giving a little bit of background on yourself and kind of what you do at BrightHire?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. So as you mentioned, I'm one of the founders of BrightHire. We've been at it for 3.5, 4 years. Before that, I spent 6.5 years at LinkedIn, working with global talent acquisition teams, and spent 1.5 years overseeing the insights team. So all of LinkedIn's data, made it useful for our clients and our sellers, and tracked a lot around hiring outcomes, actually what happened when people leave their jobs and how often they get promoted. So thinking about quality and measuring quality over somebody's career is something that I've been thinking quite a lot about for some time, all the way back. Started my career doing HR research for the corporate executive board. So I've been in and around the space for a long time, passion for the people side of business, and taking a new approach with BrightHire, unlocking a new data set around conversations that drive quality of hire.
That's interesting. What sort of conversations drive quality of hire?
Well, think about the hiring process. When people historically have thought about quality of hire, they've tied it back to the things that they can measure. Like, what was the source of that candidate? Were they a referral? Or did we find them on LinkedIn, or did they come from Indeed? Because we know that data. So let's try to draw some correlation between the ponds that we're fishing in and who is good. Then you started to get teams saying, well, are there characteristics of candidates that we can see on their resume or on their LinkedIn profile? Like, what previous companies did they work for, or where did they go to school, or, did they get promoted 3 times before we hired them? And again, can we draw correlations between those inputs and whether somebody turned out to be good? What nobody was able to do was say, well, what did we ask this person in an interview? Like, how did they show up? What did they say? How did they describe their experience? And did those interactions have any bearing on whether we made good decisions over time? Because that data didn't exist. And especially as you start to think about transparency, fairness, equity, inclusion, many of those previous rubrics were starting to break down, right? If you were pointing at referrals versus applicants as a great source of hire, well, guess what? Our personal networks probably aren't incredibly diverse, and so that's actually working disadvantageously against an inclusive version of quality of hire. Or if I think about the company somebody worked at or the school that they went to, again, it's not a particularly inclusive way to think about quality of hire. But if I can understand what happened in the conversations, in the interviews, in the recruiter screen, the hiring manager screen, the onsite, and we can take a more objective look at how somebody actually showed up, how they described their skills, their experience, their competencies, and use that as an input to then track over time, now you'd have a really valuable data set to use as a foundation to start to measure quality of hire.
That's awesome. And what's sort of interesting to me about it is there are so many things that we pick up on a subconscious level in a conversation, and that informs your gut feel for whether or not I want to hire somebody. And your gut is fine, right? But it's not as good as a piece of technology that can systematically understand signals and also compare them across a very large data set, and then take out the various biases that you might have as an individual in your experience. So
yeah, your gut's not fine. Your gut's systematically biased towards certain people, and so historically, we've tried to build diverse interview panels to get multiple perspectives on a candidate, before you make a decision. But even then, we were partnered very closely with applicant tracking systems, including Lever and Greenhouse and Workday. And Greenhouse is a great example. They send out a reminder when you're supposed to fill out your scorecard that comes an hour after the interview and says, hey, by now you've forgotten 44% of what you talked about in that conversation. Right. So and that's not system. What am I remembering? What am I not remembering? To have that be the foundation for hiring decisions. Well, that 44% that disappears is just filled with mental shortcuts and bias and subjectivity. And so to be able to remove that by creating transparency, by being able to triangulate perspectives. So, you and I both speak with a candidate, have very different perspectives, we can now actually see what we each covered. Can really help to mitigate potential bias in the process and make sure we're making confident decisions.
it's pretty interesting. Somebody told me a week ago that they realized the majority, this is a people analytics founder, the majority of poor hires were made in hiring processes that were outside the norm. So you think about most of these people came in late, hey, somebody referred them, or maybe a third-party recruiter brought them in and they didn't do the initial assessment. They didn't do, this other part of it. And maybe they kind of skipped to the end and they were hired for whatever reason, right? But it wasn't sort of the full vetting process. And I think there are some analogs here where there's just like a lot of ways that these systems can break down, and that us as individuals can trick ourselves one way or the other about a person based on signals that aren't actually going to inform whether or not this is going to be a good colleague or not. So
yeah, that makes perfect sense, right? If you're under the gun, the seat's been open, or somebody comes in with a referral, you want to move that person as fast as possible. They've got an exploding offer that you need to compete with, and so you start to cut corners. But even when you run the full process, right? We have our 6 conversations, and we're all supposed to cover this specific thing. Did we? Does that actually happen, or did we spend most of those 6 conversations saying like, hey, Phil, tell me about your background, and then it's like 15 minutes in, and all of a sudden we haven't gotten any net new information, except I've developed a like or dislike or a feeling about you just by how you showed up. And again, I can't get anybody to check that because there's no visibility into that interaction, whatsoever.
Yeah. I guess a lot of people talk about quality of hire. I wonder if you have a definition and maybe like the way that you think about measuring it.
I wish that I could come up with like one specific definition and put a stake in the ground and say this is the way to do it. But in some context, it would be wrong. You have to tie to performance in some way, right? Making a hire is not necessarily quality, right? So there has to be some sort of longitudinal, time passed to be able to assess, was this a good decision or not? So one way to think about this is, what should be the standard ramp time for a role? An SDR or a bank teller might be very different than a director of product management or a CEO. And so one vector you need to think about is, how long should it take for me to have some semblance of an idea of whether this person is actually performant in the job? Then you have to think about, what is a single measure of performance that we can use consistently across that role or function, so we don't have to make it up bespoke every single time. In some instances, that's really simple. Like, is this person still with the company 6 months down the road? Because in some high volume, high attrition roles, that is absolutely a measure of success. In some cases, that might be 3 months, right? Or 2 months. In others, it might be, how fast can you ramp to productivity? A new recruiter, like how fast are they carrying a full rec load? Or a salesperson, how quickly are they building pipeline? And while there's always nuance, you should be able to know pretty consistently if you're operating at scale. And if I'm looking at this one metric, it's a pretty good indicator of success. Senior level roles is harder because there's way more context and nuance and dimensions, and somebody's ramp period might not ultimately correlate with performance over time. So we typically see much more standardized and scalable approaches when you're talking about entry-level roles to mid-level roles, and you can define a period of time where you're going to measure that performance and a single metric that's going to be indicative of that performance. Now, sometimes, and this is probably like a second best option, let's just take a qualitative stance on performance. So I don't have ramp time, or I don't have quota attainment, or I don't have retention, but I have the perception of the hiring manager. Hey, was Phil a good hire? Like, if I went back, would I hire him again? And the perception of the candidate. Like, is this the job that I thought I was signing up for? Because part of quality of hire is I walked into a job that I felt prepared to do, and the expectations were clear, and that was made clear during the hiring process. And so you see some approaches where it's, let's triangulate a perspective between the hiring manager and the candidate on, was this everything that we expected? And that's kind of your best, guess. But ideally, you have some sort of specific measure, function by function, to measure, this person with confidence is performing at the level that we would expect consistently over time.
Do you find that the sort of analysis that you guys are doing is more impactful or has a higher signal, I guess, for certain types of roles?
We've seen a lot of value in a couple. Well, in the ones that I described. So one is high volume, high attrition. To say, hey, we have this really short half-life of knowing whether we made the right call. A lot of times in those instances, it's not just the capability of the candidate, it's really about the expectations that were set for that role. What am I stepping into? Take like a contact center role, for example. That can be like a grueling job, really difficult. And if you don't really know what you're signing up for, and then 3 weeks in, you're like, wow, I didn't know people were going to be yelling at me all day, you opt out. And so what we've been able to do in those sorts of instances is look at the interview process and look at both sides of it. How did the candidate show up? What were the quality of their answers, the depth of their answers, but also what did the interviewer or the interview team share? Like, were they explicit in describing the role? What kinds of language did they use? And by looking at both sides, be able to understand not just the characteristics of a candidate that lead to a good hiring decision or good outcome, but the characteristics of a hiring experience that lead to consistently good outcomes. What are the characteristics of the candidate, and what are the characteristics of what we need to share in that process? And we've seen teams been able to re-architect how they run and structure their interviews by saying, hey, we hired all these people and they were great. We hired all these people and they traded within the first 3 months. And we've gone back to all of these inputs and we understand, hey, we didn't ask this question, or the candidate showed up like this, or those sorts of specific inputs, and actually redesign the process to get to better outcomes. So that's one great, like very concrete example where there is a very clear measure early on of what quality looks like. You can do the same thing again for sales and ramping, customer success, and the size of the book they're handling, recruiters and rec loads, those sorts of roles that have quantifiable metrics associated with them.
Got it. So it's really about, is there a somewhat objective way to understand whether or not they are a quality hire, post-hire, and then also how tight is that feedback loop where, shorter half-lives allow you to iterate much faster and figure out the process.
That's right. And, it's just naturally going to be harder if I'm hiring a bespoke role. This is the first time we're ever hiring for a product marketing manager. What is the measure of success in that role, and how quickly is it going to take me to know whether that hire was good? Having the inputs in that case is less about, developing a science to re-architect your interview process. It's more about, in the instance that we make a mistake, and we make mistakes all the time, like it's just impossible not to. I think there's actually maybe like 40 or 45% of hires within the first 12 to 18 months turn out not to have been a good fit for the role. So this is prevalent. In those instances, if you've captured all the inputs, at least you can go debrief. Well, what did we do in that conversation? What did we ask? What did we say? What did we miss? Let's look at that objectively now and try to learn from that experience, just like you would try to debrief and learn from any experience in business. It just happens to be that hiring is the one process that's done with zero visibility or accountability. So you can't do that work today. And so we're changing that for teams. And so that's what the approach on the one-off, unique role, bespoke, harder to measure quality of hire. It's less about turning it into a science and more about being able to be informed of the debrief of what we should do right the next time.
Do you find that teams understand how to articulate the value to themselves as well as internal stakeholders around this? It's sort of, obviously HR sort of has a black mark against it in terms of calculations in general, but you're sort of selling to TA, and then there's like an HR component around like the post person. And I'm curious how you find teams are able to or not kind of figure that ROI calculation out.
Yeah, the ROI story might be a little bit different depending on the context that you're operating in. So when we're talking to teams that are high volume, high attrition, and it's, hey, we're going to run this on your system for, 18 months, 24 months. The first several months, we're going to be learning and gathering data. Then we're going to give you recommendations. And then we're going to actually re-architect your process to reduce attrition. It's very easy to quantify what reducing attrition is going to mean for that business. And those numbers are very big. So that's like a very quantitative approach that actually ties directly to like a quality of hire story. In other instances, particularly in today's environment, every recruiting team is just trying to do more with less. Like I need my recruiters to carry a higher rec load. I need my interviewers in less interviews because it's much more important for my engineers to be building code or my sellers to be out selling, as opposed to being stuck in endless interview loops. And so just the sheer efficiency that we can drive through the funnel, improving pass-through rates, shortening time to hire and time to fill, and enabling recruiters to increase their capacity. Those are the metrics that talent acquisition leaders are leaning on to make the case that BrightHire is valuable even in this sort of environment.
Got it. Is it fair to say that, and I feel like 5 years ago, like the AI stuff was sort of a buzzword, and maybe now it's a lot more than that, but like, is it fair to say that you guys are using this sort of learning technology to help assist in the hiring process? And like, what are your thoughts on like the future of how that paradigm will evolve?
Pretty mind-blowing, honestly. Like the last like month and a half has been unbelievable. To be able to run an interview on BrightHire and go back and review notes that were generated by AI that are fundamentally better than the notes that I would have taken myself, like more comprehensive, more detailed, more objective. That's pretty wild. Then to think about one of our engineers was just like, internally shipping this morning. And I was like, a candidate goes through 5 or 6 interviews and you're the final interviewer. So like, you're like, I'm going to get half an hour with this candidate. What should we talk about? Let's say it's for a sales role. Mm-hmm. And before that conversation, you can just query like, hey, did anybody ask Teddy about his quota attainment? And you can just like answer the question and find the moment and then prepare for how you're going to run that next conversation. Like natural language semantic search on every conversation to prepare people to make confident decisions it's going to completely transform how teams think about making hiring decisions, about how they deliver candidate experience, about what we can learn about our candidates and about the candidate market from all of our interviews, all this intelligence that we would gather about comp or their sentiment about our brand or like what, how they react to our, return to work policy, all this stuff that was first, previously anecdotes. Now we'll literally be able to like semantic search and just give you insights about what, candidates are thinking or what we've tested for or what's trending. It's going to completely transform the way that talent acquisition and people leaders think about the power of what happens in these conversations and how much you can extract from them. It's pretty wild.
Do you have any fears about where the human may be taken out of this equation in the future around assessments, generally speaking?
Before you said assessments, I would have said like I'm actually really excited about where people will be taken out of the process in many respects because they're doing like mundane work that should just be automated. That's not necessarily our business, but I think there's a lot of value to deliver to recruiting teams in that respect. I do think, I think the EEOC has tried to get out ahead of this a little bit in terms of developing a posture of regulation with respect to AI assessment of candidates and ensuring that that is fair and equitable and defensible, that it's like, if I'm going to use an algorithm to score candidates, it's not a black box. When we started BrightHire, we started with the premise that hiring is human and that while human judgment is fallible, it's still like the best that we've got in terms of making decisions about candidates. But it could be far less fallible if you have perfect objective information, if that information can be shared across multiple people who can all look at it together, and if you can have the ability to extract patterns of behavior across lots of conversations that would have been impossible to see otherwise. Like, are we interviewing men and women in the same ways or asking the same questions, which like, unless you have a data set, it's impossible to do. And so I would be skeptical of platforms that say, hey, we're going to use AI to tell you this is a great candidate. But I'm very bullish on AI being able to say, we had 7 things we wanted to test for in these 5 interviews. How confident are we that we tested for them at a level of depth that we should be able to stand on? Which of those things didn't we cover? We have half an hour left. What should we cover in that half an hour? And can you automatically feed me the summaries of those things that we thought we were supposed to cover so we can actually make sure that we feel good about it? That I feel great about. Like that's going to completely transform, it's like an AI assist for people to make much more confident decisions, more fair decisions. And that's where our roadmap is focused. And that's what I'm really excited about.
Yeah, that's a very exciting vision and seems achievable, which is like kind of crazy actually, to think about the technology is that good. I know you sort of touched on a number of these throughout our conversation, but if you had, 90 seconds in an elevator with somebody and you had to desperately give them a list of things to do in an interview process to drive quality of hire, what would be on that list?
Be very clear about what you are looking for. Not just in terms of the skills, but in terms of the environment that that person needs to thrive in, and in terms of the things that 3, 6, 12, 18 months out, they will have achieved, so that you can be very clear to the candidate as you speak with them about what the expectations are, and you can map possibly transferable skills and competencies and experiences onto what you are looking for. So you're not incredibly narrow about what's going to be fit for that role. That's the most important thing. If I only had 30 seconds, it's that. Beyond that, it's actually define the questions that you want to ask and have a sense for what you're looking for in the answers, like what the rubric is. Very often we come up with the plan, but then we don't calibrate on what great sounds like. And so then we spin our wheels across the team with a difference of perspective of what really good sounds like. And then the last, and this is a plug for BrightHire, but it is unbelievable to be able to get a second opinion on what you've heard. It's most hiring managers are not confident because they haven't done this a lot, right? It's a low frequency activity that has a lot of impact and a very long learning cycle. Like that's not something that you get good at unless you've done it for 30 years. And so the ability to ask for a second opinion on what you've heard or how you've structured an interview is incredibly valuable. And so if you don't have technology, have somebody ride along or invite somebody to shadow. And if you do have technology, being able to source the opinion of somebody who's much more senior, has done this a long time, can be incredibly valuable. And that's a lot of the feedback that we get from folks on BrightHire is, man, it was incredibly useful for me to get Phil's take on that candidate, how I ran it, because he's got a completely different perspective that I really benefit from, that helps me make that decision really quickly and helps me learn how to do this really hard job much better.
That's awesome. Super quick aside, you're a Harvard Business School graduate. I was, I think, 3 years after you. My year was the first year they had scribes in the classroom because so much of your grade was dependent on class participation. And they found that the professors had a very strong bias towards mostly American men. And so the scribe was there to have an objective transcript of what actually happened, and therefore what should people's grades be. And
Yeah,
you guys are basically doing that on steroids for interviews, which is pretty cool.
who spoke for how long, in what order, what topics were covered, right? There's all that data. Imagine that scribe is like literally mapping out like who got called on first today and tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And like that, if that data doesn't exist, then you don't know. You can't influence, you can't make change. But once you actually codify it and you quantify it and you can make it visual, all of a sudden it lights up. And that's exactly what we see. It's like, oh my goodness, there's 2 departments where we've been asking men way more questions in their interviews than women. What's going on there? Let me go inspect. And say, oh wow, we're actually running completely different interviews for male and female candidates for this role. That's not good. Let's go fix it. The same exact paradigm.
Yeah, that's awesome. Where can people learn more about BrightHire or get in touch if their interest is piqued?
Two places, BrightHire.com. That's our website. It's pretty straightforward. The other is you'll find there our Shine community. It's a Slack group of now probably over 13 or 1400 talent acquisition professionals. Less about BrightHire and more about what's going on in the space. A lot of learning and learning support, digging into tools and figuring out like what works and getting recommendations for how to stand things up. It's an incredibly vibrant community. It's been very cool to be a part of and to help create. And so if you're really looking to like build relationships and learn, that's a fantastic place to be as well.
Awesome. Teddy, thank you so much.
Thanks, Phil.